Hello again, I'm Calvin, and this is part 1 of my Mage Build guide for GURPS. This will be a series, but while I am trying to keep to my weekly release schedule, probably interspersed there will be a video about armor, something else in there along the way, just so I don't choke up my feed with nothing about stuff for wizards. As much as I like playing them, not everyone plays wizards. In fact, probably most people aren't playing wizards, so I'll try to put in some stuff for, the lowly melee users. This is specifically about what tends to be called GURPS magic with a capital M. It's what you'll find in Chapter 5 of the basic set. There's also a whole book just called GURPS Magic, and it's what we'll be focusing on today. There are other magic systems, like Ritual Path Magic, usually abbreviated as RPM, or Sorcery. I'm a big fan of both of those, but they're not where most people start. Like I said, this is right in the basic set. It's right there for you, and it's what most people will lean towards when they're first starting out. I also find it's the easiest to understand. Ritual Path Magic and Sorcery are great if you're more familiar with GURPS as a system, but if you lack the familiarity, neither book makes a whole lot of sense, honestly. So we'll use GURPS Magic, and I'll guide you through the process of designing your own wizard. I'm not giving you a specific build to follow, mostly because I don't know what your game is like. I don't know what your tech level is. I don't know how many points your GM has given you. I don't know any of this. So what I'm trying to do is give you the information you need to make an intelligent decision. So some people will criticize the basic magic system as being kind of broken, but I think they get the wrong idea of what it's trying to accomplish. If you're familiar with something like Dungeons & Dragons, where everything's very stratified into spell levels, like you get Fireball at spell level 3, and Lightning Bolt and its contemporaries are all in the same spell if you get access to them all at the same time. That's not what this is like. Instead, a lot of the prerequisites are based on the complexity, like I said with Fireball. Well, Fireball does a lot of damage. It's very nice to be able to chuck fire at people you don't like. It's not actually that complex. Like I said, all you do is make fire and you throw it at someone. What is complex is a haircut. And that's why the haircut spell tends to be one that people will pick on in the forums, on Reddit, and so on, because the haircut spell has tons and tons of prerequisites. But, like, in the context of a magical world, throwing a fireball, that makes sense. Like, that's one of the first things someone's going to learn to defend themselves as a mage. But if you want to individually cut every hair on someone's head and style it nicely, that is not a simple process. So haircut is a very, very high prerequisite spell. And if you can work with that system, like you understand that's why things are the way they are, you'll go a lot further. So you'll see to my top left and top right, you've got the GURPS character sheet. This is from the application called GURPS character sheet. It's free. It's what I use to build my characters. Very good. I highly recommend it, both for new people and for people who've been playing the game for ages. I'd much rather not do the math. This takes care of all that stuff for you. And then if you're using a paper sheet, it's up here. And as I go through talking about different sections of the sheet, I'll be highlighting it in yellow. So we'll be starting off with strength. It's at the top here. You don't need it. If you're a mage, you don't need strength. Maybe if you're a spell sword, you might consider it. The thing is, once I get to my spells video, you're going to see that there are a bunch of spells that are basically variations on magic elemental lightsaber, and strength doesn't help you do more damage with those spells. So mages only really need strength for carrying their gear. Even spell swords, that might mean armor, but like I said, you don't need strength for damage. So what you might buy instead of buying full cost strength is buying lifting strength. It's 3 points per level instead of 10, and it increases your encumbrance in much the same way. I believe it's also got limited utility in grappling, but if you're a mage, you do not want to be in a grapple ever, because you will die very quickly. I still probably wouldn't buy it unless you are a spell sword and you need the extra carrying capacity to be able to bring heavier armor, because most of the spellcasting gear is light. Your heaviest thing is probably going to be a staff. Beyond that, you're going to have some gemstones like magic circlets. I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, so don't buy it. On the other hand, you might be tempted to reduce your strength to get some points back, because it's 10 points per level. You could use those 10 points elsewhere. Don't do that. The problem with buying your strength down, it's right here. If you buy your strength down by 1 level, sure, you get 10 points back, but because of the way that basic lift scales, you actually lose 20% of your encumbrance, which, like I said, your stuff is light, but it's not that light. You go from having 20 pounds of space to having 16 pounds. That's a fairly large drop. It also counts against your disadvantage limit, and there are much better ways if you want 10 points to get 10 points with something like a code of honor. Like you're a professional. If you say you'll do a job and you've been paid, you'll do the job. That's much more interesting than saying, oh, my character's got 1 less strength. Like, it's not cool. It's not helpful in a meta sense. Like, even as honestly a pretty big munchkin, I'm not buying down my strength. I'm taking the Code of Honor, or I'm finding some other disadvantage to get that extra 10 points. It also reduces your next attribute, which is hit points, since the two are linked together. If you have 10 points of strength, if you have 10 points of hit points. That said, I still wouldn't increase your hit points unless you fall into one of two categories, either blood mages or spell swords. Spell swords are going to be a lot closer to the fight. Like if you're using that magic lightsaber, you're probably going to be standing a hell of a lot closer to, the orc swinging an axe. So you'll want a bit more hit points to cover the chip damage you're going to accumulate, and just to have a larger buffer before you start running into stuff like death checks, unconsciousness, all the sorts of things that make your character die. And then blood mages will want to use it to cast spells with. You can use hit points and fatigue points both to cast spells. They're your sources of mana. If you're not a blood mage, you don't want to do this. But if you're spec'd out for it, like you've taken the requisite advantages or perks, which I'll talk about in future videos, it is a good option because hit points only cost 2 per level, whereas fatigue points are 3 per level. So, there's some cost savings there. For everyone else, including blood mages, just don't take damage. That's going to be the main focus of the guide. Is often when I build a mage, I'll look back on an entire campaign, like multiple sessions, maybe over a year, and I'll realize I only took damage like once or twice in the whole campaign. I've even done campaigns where I never get damaged. And if you follow my guide, you can do it too. There's lots of options as a wizard or as a mage just to avoid damage entirely, and that's what we're going to go for here. So next up, we've got IQ, that's your intelligence, and its related advantage, magery. That's what determines how talented you are as an actual spellcaster. I've had plenty of characters where I've purchased nothing but IQ. I've left all the attributes at 10. That is perfectly fine. That is a very solid build. Like if you buy nothing but IQ, you're not making a bad choice. It determines your skill levels, both with IQ-based skills and with all your spells, since they're just IQ-based skills as well. Higher is obviously better, but it's often hard in GURPS, which is such a free-form system, to figure out where to stop. Like if you've got 200 points to spend, you might be wondering, why don't I just put all 200 points into IQ and magery? And the answer is because you don't really need to. There's a couple of breakpoints you want to hit, and I'll guide you through them. So if you're in a really low point game, like you're supposed to be some sort of magical novice, or you want to design your character to be a magical novice, what you want to aim for is the 10 breakpoint. So skill level of 10 to 14, somewhere in that range. You're casting the spell exactly as it exists in the book. You're not getting a cost discount. There's no time discount. And you need to both speak and gesture to cast the spell. But that's obviously got some limitations. Like if you've got more points, if you're anything other than a novice, like if you want to have you want to be the wizard. Like you're not like a guy who's going to be a wizard in a couple years. You are the party wizard. What you want to aim for is skill 15 or skill 20. At skill 15, you can either speak or gesture to cast the spell. You don't have to do both. So if you're only gagged but not bound, you can still cast the spell to break out, or vice versa. It also reduces the cost to cast the spell by 1 point. 1 point of mana, that is, which if it already only costs 1 point, or it only takes 1 point to maintain the spell, you can cast it for free and maintain it for free, which is superb. And then at 20, the cost discount goes up another level, so spell costs are reduced by 2, and then the time to cast the spell is cut in half. The minimum is always 1 second, so you can't cast the spell instantly, but there are plenty of buffs with 2 or 3 second casting times that in combat that's a bit much to try to use it to actively instead of casting it beforehand. But if you got skill 20, potentially you can in a pinch cast one of those in combat. I'm going to go over how you hit these breakpoints in the video about spells, which will come later. But for now, just trust that if you put 1 skill point into learning a spell, the resulting skill level is your IQ plus your magery minus 2. So if you've got IQ 15, you've got 2 levels of magery, your resulting skill level is 15. And that hits your breakpoint. So then you might be wondering, okay, if I'm adding up IQ and magery, which do I buy? Do I buy more IQ? Do I buy more magery? And the answer is usually fairly simple. A lot of the time your GM is going to limit the amount of magery you're allowed to purchase. It's very typical that this limit will be set at 3. It's what the basic set will recommend. But it could be lower, it could be higher. Just buy all the magery you possibly can because it's cheaper than IQ. Magery is 10 points per level, IQ is 20. You can also stick limitations on the magery, which I will talk about, again, another video, to make it even cheaper. So buy the max amount of magery, and then whatever more in IQ you need to get up to the breakpoint, just buy the rest in IQ. Next up are will and perception. By default, these are going to stay matched with your IQ. That is definitely a very good thing. Your will helps you with your mental saves. That's stuff like fear, mind control, and so on. And then perception helps you with your sixth senses. That sixth sense is going to be your magic sense. Having any level of magery gives you the sense to like passively notice magical items, magical auras, that sort of thing. And your magery gets added to your perception when it comes to your sense of magic. So you're probably going to be rolling fairly high to notice that something's magical. You might not notice exactly what specifically it does, but you'll know, okay, that sword, definitely a magic sword. You're likely to have the best or second best perception in the group as a consequence of this. You know, maybe the thief's going to buy up his perception, but maybe not. There's also going to be spells to enhance your senses further. Hawk vision, you know, night vision, all this sort of thing. So I honestly wouldn't bother adding any more perception. You just don't need it. As for willpower, again, you're likely to have the highest or second highest. Again, I wouldn't add more. It's not worth the points because you're already going to be at the point where, like, if you got a willpower of 15, going up to a willpower of 16, that's only a 3% change in chance of success. So you've already got plenty. Don't get greedy. The other alternative actually is to buy it down one level. This usually gets referred to on the forums as IQ with an exclamation mark. Basically, the idea is you've bought the being smart part of a level of intelligence, but not the increased willpower or perception. If you need more points, this can be a good option because you can get an extra 10. And typically, again, this is going to depend on your GM, but depending on their interpretation, that might not count as going against your disadvantage limit. Like you haven't got rid of 2 levels of willpower and perception, you just haven't purchased 2 levels of willpower and perception. Especially if you're already at kind of like 15 willpower, 15 perception, that's the point where I consider doing this. Below that, I wouldn't. Again, don't get greedy. Next up is your dexterity. Dexterity is a superb stat that you're not going to buy any levels of. Yes, it helps you move quickly, but you've got the haste spell. Helps you act sooner, you've got the haste spell. Helps you dodge and parry, you've got blocking spells. Really good, too expensive for you to even look at as a spellcaster. Maybe if you're a spell sword, you might consider buying a level or 2 of it. But even then, like if I was going to build an absolutely optimal spell sword, I would just focus more into, you know, being able to cast haste all the time, being able to cast blocking spells all the time. I would not worry about dexterity. What other characters need dexterity for? You have a plethora of spells, so don't worry about it. Don't buy any dexterity, though again, same with strength, don't buy it down either, because it's less common than saves against will or health, but there will be, you know, dexterity checks to not slip and fall. And if you slip and fall, it takes some time to get back up, and in that time, someone's going to walk over and stab you. Health is next with its companion fatigue points, much like strength and hit points stick together, health and fatigue points stick together. It's often also the only other attribute I'll even consider buying when I'm building a mage. Your will is going to be tremendous, as I've previously mentioned, so what you got to watch out for is health-based save attacks. Your fatigue is also only limited to 130% of your health, like you can't buy more than that. There's going to be perks to exclude this. Watch my perks video when it comes out. But that means if you've got a health of 10, you can only buy up to 3 more fatigue points. And as mentioned before, fatigue points are your mana, and you want as much mana as possible. Health also boosts your speed and your move a little bit. You do have magic to increase those, like I said, the haste spell. But health is not that expensive, and like I said, it helps with your buffs, so your saves rather. So you might want it anyway. If you can, try to aim for 12. It's a good level. If you're in a really low point game, okay, stay at 10. Focus on spell-based defenses to the sort of things you need health for. But if you have a few points to spend, try to hit HT 12. 14 is a bit of a reach, but if you're in a higher point game anyway, I would definitely hit 14. It's going to boost your move up to 6, and again, you will get nicer health saves. There's your fatigue points, which is, like I said, effectively your mana. Unless you're a blood mage, it's your only source of mana that's innate to your person. There are alternatives, but both of them have issues. There's your hit points, like I said, and if you're not a blood mage, you're going to take shock penalties every time you use your hit points. That means if you burn 1 hit point, you're at -1 to everything that turn, including the roll to cast the spell you just burnt the hit point for. So, not a great idea unless you're a blood mage. And then there's power stones, which are magic gems that have mana in them. I'll talk about them more in the gear video. If you've got a lot of money, by all means, buy tons of power stones. Leave your fatigue points at the base level. But if you don't have tons of money, get more fatigue points. Next up are basic speed and basic move. The value of these two cannot be overstated. High movement is great in GURPS. Being able to go first is great in GURPS, especially since there's no roll involved unless you're tied basic speed and dexterity with someone else. But you're a caster. So you've got spells to kind of deal with these two things, and both of these stats are expensive to buy. It's 5 points per level. So to get an extra space of move, you got to spend 5 character points, and to get an extra quarter basic speed, again, it's 5 character points. They're based on the combination of dexterity and health that sets your base level for both of these. So you'll get a bit of a boost from your health if you bought that up, which is nice. But beyond that, for these two, I would just use magic. So not something I would spend points on, but something I would keep in mind when you're picking spells to try to increase these. So finally, you have your size modifier. So a basic human size modifier 0, that's someone between like 6 feet and 4.5 feet. That encompasses almost all humans. I mean, in theory, I'm size modifier +1, but you know, if I play someone my size in GURPS, I just put myself in as size modifier 0 because I don't have gigantism. You can pick either dwarfism or gigantism for your own mage, and it gives your character, you know, pathological dwarfism, pathological gigantism. But I would only take these for specialized builds. Gigantism does have a lot of nice benefits, and if you're a spell sword, I would highly recommend trying to make this work. You get +1 move, and I've already mentioned move is great. +1 to intimidate, not like the same broad utility, but that's nice. You get +1 in grapples to hit. Don't grapple. And you get a 10% discount on strength and hit points, which is nice even if I have told you not to purchase either of those. Though if you're a blood mage, you know, gigantism, good option. It does make, so there's some downsides here. It does make your armor and clothing cost, you know, 10 to 20% more. But that's not actually a big deal because as a spellcaster, your armor and clothing is not going to be that expensive. And you might be thinking, Calvin, I want to throw on like tons and tons of enchantments on my armor and my clothing. Isn't that going to make it, you know, cost me more? No, actually, because like the base clothes themselves will cost a bit more, but the enchantments don't cost any extra on the clothing. Like if I put Fortify +1 on this, it's the same as, you know, a size small Fortify +1. It's like, there's no difference. So don't worry about that. You are easier to spot in a crowd. You get -2 to disguise, -2 to shadowing. Kind of a bummer, but you're a wizard, cast invisibility. Enemies also get +1 to hit you in both ranged and melee combat. That sounds really bad. That sounds like almost a deal breaker. It's not. The way that things tend to work in GURPS is it's not the enemies to hit roll that's going to determine whether you actually take damage. Instead, it's your active defense. Especially if you're facing an already highly skilled opponent, you think this is where it makes the like it's the worst penalty for coming up against like a skilled sword fighter, and you're also giving them a +1 on top of that. But you got to remember, GURPS isn't a D20 system where the probability is linear. It's a 3D6 system where the probability follows a bell curve. And if someone already has skill 15 when they're attacking you and you buff them up by 1 up to 16, because of the way the bell curve works, that's only a 3% increase in the chance you're actually going to get hit. And then you turn around and cast a blocking spell and you just negate it entirely. So I wouldn't worry about this. So I've gone on about how all the bonuses are good and how all the downsides barely matter. Why don't I recommend buying this for everybody? Especially since it's actually a 0-point feature. And it's because being at an increased size modifier doubles the cost to cast spells on you. Now, this is very good if someone's trying to cast a debuff on you, like if someone's trying to cast, I don't know, Eviscerate, they'll want to rip out your liver. It's going to cost them twice as much energy to do so, which for a lot of the worst debuffs you're kind of going to worry about, might just make it too expensive for them to cast. Or if they do cast, congratulations, you've just taken out their whole mana reserve. The trouble is it goes both ways. So I've been talking about how awesome haste is. There's plenty of characters where I will run haste almost 24/7. Haste also costs twice as much to cast. And some of the best buffs, which kind of strain your max mana, now you can't cast them at all. So spell swords and blood mages, especially if you're like a hybrid spell sword blood mage, like you can get some good utility out of this. Or if you can keep your build really tight, there are some perks that let you get rid of that the penalty for being twice as large on your energy costs. Watch the perks video. But if you can't keep your build that tight, or if you're not a spell sword or a blood mage, don't buy this. It's tempting, but it's too much of a hassle. Though to be fair, if you're a novice and you can't cast those better spells anyway, maybe worth a shot, especially if you don't believe you're ever going to get to the point where you're casting stuff like Great Haste or buffs that cost like 5 or 10 energy per shot. And then Dwarfism, I just would not take this at all. There are options here, like if you want to be, instead of a spell sword, like a kind of like a sneaky thief caster guy. Like you're one of the million Skyrim rejects, but it reduces your move. I am not a big fan of any mobility penalties. It reduces your reach, and on top of that, you use smaller weapons. So the smaller weapons themselves are likely to have reduced reach, and then on top of that, you're also at an extra -1. Now you might be thinking, I'm a wizard. What do I need with reach? And what you need with reach is a big long staff, because if you've got a staff, you add, or rather subtract the length of the staff from the range penalty to cast the spell on somebody. So, like I could have a 6-foot staff, I reduce any range penalty to any opponent by 2. That is superb. And if you have Dwarfism, you might only get, a -1 to the range penalty, or potentially if your staff is too short, you might not get any bonus at all. You also get the same penalty to disguise and shadowing that someone with Gigantism has, though again, you could just cast invisibility. It doesn't make your strength cost any more. It doesn't reduce the cost to cast spells on you, and it only gives you back 15 points. And just the move is 5 points on its own. I wouldn't even know how to stat the reduced reach, but it's probably 5 or 10 points. This is just not worth it. It doesn't give you back enough points to be worth the hassle, and it doesn't have really any benefits except your size modifier is reduced by 1, which I suppose does make it harder for people to hit you, because they're going to get a -1 to hit. But as I mentioned with the Gigantism thing, it's not the 2-hit roll you're worried about, it's your defense, and this doesn't do anything to help your defense. Yeah, and I never give up movement if I can help it. So what are my conclusions here? So, if this is too long and you didn't watch, I'll probably put a time code or something in here so you can skip to this point. Buy the max magery your GM allows. Subscribe to my channel. Buy enough IQ to bring your base spell level up to 15 or 20. Like the video. Think about buying some health. It's not that important. Leave a comment complaining about, my lighting setup or my love of movement and hatred of grappling. And then buy enough FP to bring you up to whatever your cap is. 30% bonus on top of your health. So next up, I'm going to be going over the sort of advantages you want to take as a mage, particularly magery, which I've touched on briefly here, talking about the sort of limitations you want to take on your magery to make it cheaper. There are some enhancements, I'll touch on those briefly, but honestly, most of the way you get good as a mage is by making yourself worse, because it gives you more points to spend on things like chucking lightning bolts at people. So that's all for my mage build guide, and I've already told you to go fight in the comments, so hop to it.